Welcome back to In Our Own Defense podcast. We're your host, Dr. Dolores Tarver, and myself, Attorney A.D. Winters. In this episode, we're unpacking, am I ready to date? The dating conundrum, as it were. And we've talked about it from racial, spatial. We've talked about it from familial to our early on set experiences. And so now, we've talked about what qualifies as a dating coach. But Dr. Tarver, I know you wanted to talk about grief as it relates to dating. What are some of the things you're seeing?
Yes, Attorney Winters. The challenge, I think, for a lot of my clients is, as we were talking about in the opening, is what happens when I come into a relationship and I'm still grieving maybe the loss of another relationship. That could be a familial relationship, or it could be a relationship with a past partner. And so I'm entering into something before I've healed from something else, or what happens if I'm that person who, as we talked about earlier, doesn't want to be by myself. And I find that I have a hard time functioning, or I feel like I have a hard time functioning if I'm not in a relationship with someone. We refer to that sometimes as co-dependency, where I value you more than I value me in the space. And so it's almost like I need you to breathe, if you will. And what about these other dynamics of if I've had a domestic abuse situation in my previous dating relationships, or if I'm the person who tends to be aggressive in relationships? How can some of those factors affect my decision to choose to be in a relationship at this point in my life? Who wants to start with the heavy? How about, let's see, Dr. Kurt, why don't you start? I think Ms. Johnson hit that. She had to hit it first the last time, so we'll allow you to go ahead and get that heavy question first.
All right. I just need one favor, Dr. Tarver. Repeat that question one more time, if you don't mind, please, pretty please.
Absolutely, because I asked you about 16 things in the question, which Attorney Winters has told me to stop doing, but I keep doing it. So if I'm experiencing grief and loss from a past relationship, if I've been in a domestic violence situation where either I was a perpetrator of domestic violence or I was a survivor of domestic violence, or if I'm a person that tends to be codependent in relationships, what are some of the factors and recommendations you would make to people in terms of dating with those dynamics?
Great. So again, dating and moving into the relationship are not synonymous, obviously. I think that there is a place to date as you're healing. I also think there's a place to move into slowly a relationship as you're healing, right? It gives you a healthy relationship, could be a catalyst for your healing, particularly if you're with a partner who allows you to show up as being your best self and practice and unpractice some of those things that may have been traumatizing in previous relationships. What I share with a lot of both men and women couples is this whole notion about domestic violence and what that actually means and look like, because I'm not always for certain that we all see it or even feel or think of it the same. And that comes into how we relate to people. So generally, particularly as men, we think of domestic violence as the physical abuse and even the emotional abuse and even the mental abuse. But what we don't talk about is the controlling and abusive behaviors that lead up to domestic violence, right? And even if it doesn't lead up to domestic violence, it leads up to domestically violating one another, right? So it doesn't have to go to the violence part, but both people involved, we violate each other by using controlling and abusive behaviors, which causes us to be problematic for another relationship. So you may have been in a relationship, y'all may have been great, 10 years, he or she may not have put a hand on you, but you were traumatized for whatever reason, or you were re-traumatized for some of your earlier behaviors. So to unpack that, what that looks like and how that goes into codependency, the whole notion of, am I able to relate? I frankly think that once you start relating to who you are, and I don't mean healthy, I mean being well, emotionally well, is when you know that you're ready to start moving into a relationship. And two things that you can look for: what's showing up in your life and how you feel. What's showing up in your life and how you feel. And if you kind of check in and monitor those two things, you can kind of gauge on how ready you are to move into a new relationship. But I drive home this whole notion that all of us have been in relationships that have experienced violent controlling and abusive behaviors, whether that's interrupting, whether, us the greed folks, we date somebody with less skills, we use ableism to try to bully him and trump conversations. We all, no exceptions on all of us who have practiced some form of controlling and abusive behaviors. Right. And so what may have worked in one relationship, you take that same thing, it becomes toxic in another. Right. May have worked in the previous one. Your new person is like, wait, slow down, G. You can't talk to me like that. It could have been passion in your previous relationship. He could have been like, I love it. So those are the things that we have to think of when it comes to control and abuse. Now, grief is a whole different thing. Right. Because grief is particularly for men, we're all grieving things now, right? On top of grief. Secondary trauma, the world is grieving. We're grieving, particularly as Black people, as Black men. We're grieving for our Black women, our Black babies. So there is grief. And even when we move out of the mourning stage, we're still in grief. And as you guys know, grief has added on about 3 or 4 more steps. I often take people to the meaning part. Not that they need to expedite and jump over the stages of grief. Like, what's this mean? Like, can we find some meaning into what this trauma and grief means for you, right? And sort of keep them focused on, is there meaning? Not on the grief itself, but for you, your purpose and your passion as we move forward as a result of some of this grief and traumas. But in the notion, I love the whole, I spend a lot of times talking about domestic violence, what that looks like from controlling and abusive behaviors, even on a subtle level, and how we communicate that to our children and our loved ones and even our friends, how men need to do the work, even when we talk from guy talk, like there's a way we can describe other women without being controlling and abusive. There's a way we can describe our current relationship. So that's the work I do. So yeah, it's a lot to that. It's a lot, but what I want to leave for all of us and our listeners is none of us are exempt from that work because we're all grieving something.
Thank you, Dr. Kurt. You navigated that pretty well. Hit those out the park for me. I appreciate, I think I appreciate the perspective. A lot of our listeners welcome hearing about just Black men, because I think that oftentimes when we have conversations about dating and relationships, our listeners sometimes feel like it's focused on women, it's not focused on men. And so to hear that part about grieving and understanding how all of us can have behaviors that may be controlling at times, or maybe unhealthy behaviors that even if they don't lead to a point of violence, they still could be very toxic. So I think those are 2 great points. Ms. Johnson.
I tell you what, Dr. Tarver, I'd love to ask Ms. Johnson. We heard the gentleman's perspective on that, and I do agree. I think Dr. Kirk hit that one out of the park. But there's something I would be remiss if I didn't get from a woman's perspective. Just like women are learning from this show when they watch our female listeners, I think our men are learning too as we do a good job of trying to have a balance on this show. I'm concerned about what women may experience, Ms. Johnson, as it relates to maneuvering past those facades that we get into in these relationships at the onset, at the outset. We look into, people put on, like Dr. Kurt said earlier, we want to put our best foot forward. We want to live in a space where we can say, look, this is my true me. And they sometimes, though, they come across eagerly to please and they give off a misrepresentation. They can't sustain what they led someone to believe that they were experiencing. How do we get past that when we see those potential or this potential or putative spouse or putative partner, putative friend? How do we get past some of those personalities and do we see those and extract those personalities? How do we do that? How do women do that?
So that's very interesting. But I'm going to do my best to unload this one here. So getting past it, I think there's a book that my therapist talks about. It's like, Shall We Dance? And she read a passage of this for me because she talks about how we can be in a dance so often and we kind of get caught up in this dance. And so I think the first thing is to acknowledge you're in a dance. You need to acknowledge that, people do put out their representative. My take is understand that people will put out a representative and understand that it takes time for the representative to go away. And then that is when you actually see what's going on. And at any point, you can still make a decision. I don't want to be here. I don't want to deal with the person that is now behind the representative. I think sometimes we get really stuck on the fact that the person presented themselves a certain way, and then it's like, that's just natural. Let's just accept that that's what it is. Because even for us, we put our best selves forward, right? You're trying to lure someone in. It's a dance, right? So just accept that. And then when you see what you don't like, make that, decide then if you still want to move forward with this. And so I think that's one part of the dating situation or scenario I would like more people to become comfortable with, that at any given point in time, you can decide this isn't working for me. That this green flag turned into a yellow flag that is now a red flag. And so I gotta go. You can decide to leave at yellow flags. You don't have to wait for them to turn red. You can decide that if with a certain amount of green flags, you're like, oh, but there's still a certain level of things missing here. And I still kind of don't want this for myself. So I'm going to still bow out. So I do think when we're looking at, the representative and how to get over that, I think it's about giving ourselves grace in terms of the dating scene and the dating scenario, that if it isn't something that you want, no matter when it shows up, it's okay to have a conversation about it. It's okay to explore it, and it's okay to then make a decision. And I think before we can really do that, we do have to get really in touch with ourselves about what we want. Because I think we date people and we're not sure what we actually want. So we end up staying longer. We end up putting up with more. And putting up with more is also layered. It could be, like Dr. Kurt said, because you were in the last scenario and somebody had a really high tolerance, you get to the next scenario and the person's tolerance is like, we stop here at 0.15, and it's like, okay, so I do think when we're looking at dealing with the representative and looking at what that looks like, I think we really have to accept that at any given time, we can change our mind and we can decide.
I think that's a good scenario to look at it. I think that's great that women, really all of us should look at it from that perspective. But I think sometimes men are extremely superficial, and Dr. Kirk, when you're hearing that men are visual creatures or kind of superficial when it comes to that, and I know as we've gotten older, we've learned that superficial foolishness just doesn't work. No matter how good a woman may look, if there's, she's not well adjusted, or a partner may look, that person's not well adjusted, then that's going to become problematic, extremely problematic early on, whether it's financials or emotional construct but from Dr. Kurt, one of the challenges that I remember as a kid, there was this TV show movie called Friday, and the guy says, hey, she don't look like Janet Jackson, she looks like Freddie Jackson. And I know that we're not specifically focused on looks in life, but that's a good telling sign of that someone presented a facade of who they were. And whether it was their own description of themselves or lead people to believe on social media that this is their well-adjusted life, and then they're vicious in their life. Not men and women, they have this facade, but they are really bleeding on people. How do you navigate that facade briefly there, Dr. Kurt?
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think generally speaking, just in relationships, we have to become better at asking questions, right? Like posing real life questions, whether they come up as any color flag, whether they sit in our mind, we have to pose questions with the notion of getting to know one another better. Right. I don't think, and of course, we hear men are this and women are that. I think that has more to do with a colonized approach to anything because I deal with both every single day, and we are all confronted with 99.99 of the same thing. We have been culturally conditioned to express it differently. There's expectations assigned to us. There's child rearing and things of that nature. But I think, as generally speaking, we have to become better at asking questions. We have to become better at asking ourselves questions. I don't think we check in enough with ourselves, right? Emotionally, like, what's this about for me? What am I showing up? For men, I have to re-examine their whole idea of what actually feelings mean. And when do they start emoting and things of that? Like, are you angry? Because as Black men, we're subjugated to a lot. So our default emotion is anger. So our person to do something and we go straight to anger. Well, I wasn't really upset. I'm actually saddened. I'm actually disappointed. I'm actually envious, you know? But my comfort level is I'm mad as hell and somebody got to do something until I start feeling better, right? And so we go through that notion of asking oneself question. Did she do or not do? Did she say or not? And what is that? Oh, I'm just triggered. It's not her, it's me. So we do a lot of that, posing questions to yourself and become better asking of questions. Become a better questioner, right? Become a better questioner. And I ain't talking about setup, tripping her up questions or him questions. I mean, you know, like what's it like with your parents, or what'd you see, or hell, what's your favorite color? I think we miss a lot of the basic nuances, like, you know, who's a better ball player, you or your sister, you know, like, and how'd you feel about that? Like, right, I just don't think we spend enough. We do too much talking about where we are, where we want to be, things of that nature, what we got, what we want to have, then going back to 6th grade basic questions, like, what'd you have to eat yesterday? So, yeah, ask better questions.
Yeah, I just was going to add that I think that in dating, we really miss out on building a foundation and building a friendship, because all the other stuff happens, life happens, you know, you are going to be going through all these other things. And kind of like Dr. Kurt said, building that friendship and understanding before like romance really gets involved, what are your triggers? And I kind of broke that down with the other question in terms of like, if you're ready beyond a relationship, and it's like that trigger, that emotional reactivity. When you are building a friendship initially, you can get to know your partner's triggers before they're kind of invested in the process of triggering them. And so then you can kind of learn it, you know, you learn the curves, you learn the, you know, maybe some of the blind spots. You can talk to them about some of the blind spots before that emotional reactivity gets really high. And I think if you do that, then you have a better shot at navigating, you know, the stuff that comes up. Because kind of like Dr. Kurt said earlier, sometimes you don't know what you're still triggered by until you get into a relationship, because sometimes if you pick the right partner, they might be a mirror, you know, they might be. So it's kind of like, oh, I didn't recognize all of this, but I do think we miss out on some of those foundational pieces that can help us know if we're ready to be in the next relationship and understand our triggers and help us curb our emotional reactivity.
I appreciate you both sharing though, I think, because we do need to be aware of triggers. I like this notion of us having conversations ahead of time. Like, let's kind of figure this stuff out before we're in a situation, because once I'm triggered, then that could lead to domestic violence, that could lead to some toxicity in the relationship. But you two pose some interesting, I think, dynamics that people need to consider. But when do we really need to think about, maybe I'm not ready to date. Maybe I don't need to be in a relationship. So maybe I am triggering, maybe I'm triggered, maybe I'm violent, maybe I'm selfish, maybe I'm codependent, maybe I'm still grieving. When do I know when I'm not? If you all can just kind of hit a few bulleted points of when do I know that I probably need to be doing more self-work than dating right now?
That's a good point. And here are my things. If you are talking way more than you listen. So in any scenario, if you are always trying to prove your point, if you're always kind of in a defense mode, or no matter, because it'll show up everywhere. So if you notice that that is happening, you're probably not ready. I would say if you are emotionally reactive to virtually everything happening, if the computer is dead and there's just like this big overhaul blow up that because computers die, right? That's a very normal thing. But if you're like explosive about the computer dying, and again, these things show up in very small ways, right? We're talking about dating, but the emotional availability, the emotional like intelligence that, you know, I can process and I can manage my emotions shows up in the small, mundane, everyday kind of task. So I would say those are kind of like my 2 points for if you're really struggling, if you are constantly defensive, and if you are emotionally explosive with things that are kind of happenstance of life. You may not necessarily be ready to date, and you may need to take some time to really kind of evaluate where you are. That's my condensed version.
2 good points. I appreciate that brevity as well with the excellent points. Dr. Kurt?
Yeah, I can recap that. Same with 2 terms I've used previously. For me, I offer people to know if they're ready or not based on 2 things: how you feel and what's already shown up in your life, right? How you feel, healthy and well. and what's currently showing up, because we're all in some current relationship. And not that it correlates to an intimate relationship, but if you check in how you feel, like you're saying, like how you feel when your relationship crashed 2 months ago before I started dating you, are you still holding on to that? How you feel the relationship with your colleagues, your sister, your brother, your stepfather, your stepmother? I always ask those questions to kind of check in, like how you feel and what's currently showing up as indicators to if you're ready to go back into a relationship. Now, dating, if you could get somebody to drive their own car and meet you at a socially distant spot so y'all can just kind of coexist for an hour or two during this time, that could be dating for you. You could be ready for some human interaction. But when it comes to in a relationship, two ways to know how well you're relating with self is to check in how you feel and what's currently showing up. Because a relationship constitutes your ability to relate, not with them, with yourself, and how that kind of rolls over into the experience with you and another person. How you feeling? What's showing up? Work on those two for now.
I think that's I'll appreciate that question, Dr. Tarver, and I appreciate it. We kind of hit on some of these things to kind of go back to. Ms. Johnson brought up the red flags, and Dr. Kirk just really kind of hit that with the take the break. But I would like for you all to get into signaling in the practice of the law. If we're going to defend somebody for domestic violence, or if we're going to prosecute someone for domestic violence, or civilly prosecute that inside of a divorce as a sub-element of the reasonings for the divorce, not specifically physical domestic violence or the emotional, or not just limited to that, but the financial control, where it's to one partner may have the finances and the financial resources, have those and tapped, and they bully the other partner into some sort of suffragist movement where they're just stuck in a space where they can't move left or right because they don't have the access to those resources. What are some of those red flags across the board that that may signal there needs to? Sometimes we date it, now we want to come to a conclusion of dating. So what are some red flags to all of you all that we should recognize and then jump in to close it out? If we could give those bulletized kind of points. I'll start with you, Dr. Kirk.
I'm going to need you to repeat the question one more time, Attorney Winters, if you don't mind.
Well, I unpacked kind of what are the things in the practice of law. We recognize clearly some of these behaviors, and that's why we have a dissolution of a marriage. We recognize that when we're prosecuting civilly and criminally of those domestic violence, emotional, physical abuse, and emotional and psychological abuse. But then we step into a space just on the dating front. How do we recognize red flags when we've already started dating? And as we're in dating, how do we recognize those red flags that say, hey, it's time to end this relationship?
That's pretty concise, right? And I'll speak from a men's point of view, and briefly from a woman point of view, as I have worked with it. And so for men, I deal with men when it becomes domestic violence or just terrible relationships. It didn't end well. And oftentimes men want to do the locker room talk, like, oh, she did this. And they've had some legitimate horror stories. And so they want to still discuss it on the same level as the woman in terms of domestic violence. And so I had to bring in misogyny and patriarchy and sexism and racism to kind of bring that whole picture in it. But I also have to talk with men about their initial selection process. You saw red flags, but then you saw big booty and other stuff too. And your homeboy said she was fine and she graduated from Spelman. So it goes back to the initial selection, but we have a different criteria. You may talk to your homeboys, your fraternity brothers, and they're like, dude, she got a PhD from, so it'll be fine. And so it starts here. oftentimes men overlook our red flags because of what it looks like or what we think we could deal with and change and things of that nature. And even for women, I've known women to date high-powered men, very assertive, closed deals, they like it. It's passionate sex appeal until it's directed towards them. So he could be on the phone closing a multi-million-dollar deal, but when he gets off the phone and directs that same passion, now he's perceived to be abusive and controlling. The money has already been transferred in the bank. He's being cheered on as being this assertive businessman with a high business acumen, but don't talk to me that way. And I think that's some good things. Obviously, he's not going to talk to a business in that, but the whole notion on how we overlook when it's convenient for different criteria and how it bites us in the butt later on when other agencies have to get involved, whether that's our family, we got to move back home, we need bail money or things of that nature. So I say pay attention to whatever colored flags. Even make sure that you are seeing the green flags as green flags, because sometimes we be seeing green flags based on our last relationship when in fact they purple. You just ain't seen no green flag in a long time.
And Miss Johnson?
So good point there. So I think in terms of understanding flag colors, right? Because basically we just turned this into a whole rainbow of flag colors. So I think in terms of understanding flag colors, you have to understand yourself, what actually makes you feel good, what doesn't make you feel good, what you're doing for, you know, the positioning or their posture in the community. Because I do think that we don't take the time to think about that. One thing I hear, oh gosh, forgive me everyone, it's like men, of course, like, I don't like women that, you know, wear all that fake lashes, makeup and wigs. I said, so don't date them, but don't tear down the woman that does. Just go off and like what you like. But there's always this kind of like, I want to cut, and it's just like, we don't have to do that to each other, you know, women and men alike. You know, you can have your preference, you can have your life, but that doesn't mean that you have to kind of always voice this, because what that's telling me is I actually might like that, but I'm wondering what that means, you know, on the back end of things, if I decide to jump in with this person, or how will other people see me if I jump in with this type of person, although I may say all of this stuff, or I have said all of this stuff now, falling in love with this woman who wears all this makeup and hair, but I done talked about women being natural for, you know, however many years on Instagram. So I do think we need to kind of really take inventory. I do think we really need to just take inventory of what we actually like, what makes us feel good, what we desire, because I think that that helps us to know what's a green flag, what's a yellow flag, what's a red flag. And to Dr. Kurt's point earlier, I don't think we talk to ourselves enough and frequently enough, right? Because our values change. Your values at 25 may not be your values at 27 and 30 and 32. And so constantly having that conversation and telling yourself, you know, this was a green flag in my last relationship. It's a yellow flag in this one, because after reflecting, I didn't really like how that felt, or I didn't like how that played out, or how that, you know, continued. So now that's a yellow flag. We're moving this along. I
like how you guys have given us the flag conversation, and I get the luxury of pulling out the checkered flag as we are coming to a conclusion for this episode. Dr. Tarver, this has been an exceptional show with Miss Johnson, Miss Janae Johnson, and Dr. Kurt on here, and they've helped us really. I think I'm moved about how we're really understanding, am I ready to date? Before we let our guests kind of close us out and tell us about some resources, Dr. Tarver, I mean, we've learned today about these definitional phraseologies that we talk about, from cuffing to DTF. I'm blushing over here with friends with benefits and Bay, and understanding what healthy relationships look like. We talked about the relationship, the time, and the spatial connection, the racial connection of these relationships, the family dynamics of these relationships, and even experiences that we encountered early on in our lives, and how that groomed the impact of our ability to date. We've even talked about the spatial connection of someone grieving a loss, whether it's familial loss or a loss of a previous relationship, and how that impacts the new relationship vis-a-vis the codependency aspect, where people just love relationships. One of the things that we tried to get past was those facades that people run into. Are there any closing words that you can help us kind of sum this up for everything that we've learned today? Dr. Tarver, please.
Attorney Winters, you went into straight lawyer mode with that summarization of factual information. I appreciate that. I will say to our viewers that we are not saying to you, don't date. I know that sometimes we end up leaving the heavy stuff for the end, and I don't want people to get the message that we're not saying you can't be in a healthy relationship and that you can't find what you're looking for and you can't navigate these things. So I like to leave people with that positive note of you absolutely can have the type of relationship that you want to have. You can have that partnership or whatever it is you desire, as long as you're in a healthy space and you pick people that are in healthy spaces too. And I want to just thank our two panelists, our two guests, for coming on and sharing their insight with us.
Well, I agree. We are so lucky. Miss Johnson, Miss Janae Johnson, she's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And Miss Johnson, I'd love for you to point us to some of your resources or how our listeners can reach out and see some of your content, read some of your past articles, or if there are any books that you would recommend or suggest vis-a-vis the teen world that you are an expert in, or in the space just overall. We'd love for you to share those resources with us, please.
Absolutely. So you guys can find me just on my hub page, which is Janae Chanel. And you can just get tagged into all of my Forbes articles and everything else that I do from that main page, even all of my teen content. But in terms of books that I would encourage women to read in particular, Women Who Run with the Wolves is one of my favorite books right now. And in the Meantime by Idyala Van Zant. And When the Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost is one of my feminist favorites. And I would just encourage all women to grab those 3 books, read them, sit with them, figure out however they move in your spirit. And if you're on Instagram and you prefer some of that inspiration on Instagram, I would follow 2 pages. One is Alex L. and the second one is Yasmin Cheyenne. So I hope you all enjoyed it today. And you can find me on Instagram at Janae Chanel.
Can you spell your Instagram handle for us, please?
Oh, sure. It's JAYNAYCHANEL.
Good deal. Thank you so much. Dr. Kurt, if you don't mind, do you think you can share with us your information and great resources? I know at I Am International, that's a profound organization, but can you share us your information?
Sure. So you can find me everywhere. Psychology Today, drcurtisdjasper.com, youareyourown.solution.com, Concierge Counseling Solutions.com. But more importantly, I like to offer people just to read, like check in. This would be the time to read. I mean, I don't have any particular reading resource. I think that there's a lot of solid writers out there. I'd say find some strong Black writers and spend this time that we've all kind of slowed down to just read. Just read. Whatever your area of interest is, just read. And whatever your area of expertise, this will be the time to tighten up on it as well. Relationship, if you're considering relationships and moving into marriage, the Gottman Institute is a good place. GOTTMAN. They do phenomenal work. I've been following them for years. I did work in domestic violence, so I just caught up on all of my bell hooks. So writing. So those are the things that I'm writing, that I'm working with now. You can find all of my books on Amazon. I've written a couple books. I've written some articles on Huffington Post. Just a regular guy who'd like to make a difference. I take a more of an educational approach than a clinical approach for my own personal and professional reasons. I think there's some significant trauma and rage and emotional damage that we as Black people can benefit from other Black practitioners, and that we can come off some of the colonized training that we've had, some of the formal training, whatever that is, mental health, even law, and sort of get into the grassroots of what this means to be connected and collaborate under Black Power. So that's what comes to mind. Look me up on Instagram. I am Dr. Kurt. Facebook, Dr. Curtis D. Jasper. Twitter, Dr. Curtis D. Jasper. Rock with me. I post a lot daily. Like to live out loud, because what's important is that the people who need to find me can find me.
Well, thank you both so much. Dr. Curtis Jasper, of course, is the Executive Director of I Am International, Inc., and he also heads Concierge Counseling Solutions. And, you know, we have Miss Janae Johnson. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist and the co-founder of the Black Brain campaign. They've been with us today on our own defense podcast to help us unpack Am I Ready to Date? They both provided us great resources, Dr. Tarver, and we're so lucky to have them here. You know, we've been discussing Am I Ready to Date with Dr. Kurt and Ms. Johnson. And this is In Our Own Defense. We're your hosts, Attorney A.D. Winters and Dr. Dolores Tarver. For more information about our podcast, please follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at In Our Own Defense, and email us at inourown defense@gmail.com. Thank you. Have a great day.